His phone shows a stranger's number saved under his name and a mall time-stamped message asking, "Can we meet?" Phone screen shows the thread. I open it. The preview reads, "Can we meet? 7:12 p.m." He watches a game in the next room. Box sits on my kitchen counter. He told me it is for my birthday next week. I hold the box and say nothing. Receipt sits crumpled in my palm. The top line reads Kiosk 12 West Mall, 7:05 p.m. The clerk's name is printed. A phone number is on the back. I tap it. Message sits on the screen. The thread opens under his name. It shows, "Hey, saw you at the kiosk. Coffee later." The time matches the receipt. He sends a thumbs up emoji. Camera sits above the kiosk. I call mall security and ask for footage. The operator says they keep clips for 30 days. She asks for my name and why. I say, "For proof." She says I need ID and a signed form. I say, "I'll come now." Wallet sits by the door. I grab my ID and the receipt. He watches me put on shoes. He says, "You're being dramatic." I say, "I'm going to the mall." He says, "Fine. Do whatever makes you feel better." Security office sits full of screens. A guard types, then pauses. He says, "We have a clip. Kiosk 12B73 to 714. I hand him the receipt. He takes it like evidence. Footage sits on the screen. A woman laughs at the kiosk. My boyfriend's back faces the camera for a second. He leans in. He takes a small wrapped box from the display. The clerk rings it up. The clerk writes a number on the receipt and pockets it. The woman hugs my boyfriend on camera, still sit on the guard's monitor. He offers a copy. I ask for it. He says I need to sign a request. I sign. My hands are steady now. He gives me a USB stick with timestamps. Screenshot sits on my phone 2 minutes later. I send the clip to my sister. I text, "Watch 7:05 to 7:12. Tell me if this is wrong." She replies in 10 seconds. "That is him. That is his jacket." She sends an old photo and circles the jacket. Screenshot becomes my anchor. I bring it home. He is still on the couch. He asks, "You found proof?" I set the phone face up on the table. He looks at the still for 1 slow second. He blinks. He says, "Okay, fine. It was a gift for someone else." I ask, "For who?" He looks away. Email sits in my inbox the next morning. The store sends a purchase record under an unknown account name. The loyalty number ends in his birth month. The timestamp is 7:07 p.m. The receipt matches the paper one. I print it. Log sits on my laptop. My call log export shows 2 calls to the unknown number on separate days. One call is at 7:15 p.m. the night of the kiosk. I print the log and circle the entries. Screenshot sits in a message my sister sends. She had messaged the clerk pretending to be a buyer. The clerk replies, "He left the number, said he wanted to see her again." My sister texts, "He gave it, not she asked." I forward everything to a friend who is a paralegal. Form sits on a desk at his work. I go to HR and ask for advice. The HR rep says they need documented patterns. I slide the receipt, the clip, the emails, and the logs across her desk. She takes notes and asks me to file a complaint. Form becomes the complaint. I list dates, times, and interactions. I attach the clip and receipts. I print my sister's texts and the clerk's screenshot. I send the email. After sending, I feel small relief. The complaint is action now. Call comes in that afternoon. It is his manager. He says, "We received a complaint." He asks if I want to meet with HR and him present. I say, "I do." The manager sets a time. I write it down. Envelope sits in my hands 2 days later. HR writes they take concerns seriously and will interview my boyfriend and the clerk. They offer mediation and ask if I want to attend. I check, yes. I sign. Screenshot sits between us like fact. My sister calls the clerk and asks for his full name. He gives it and sends a time clock screenshot. It shows he worked at 7:00 p.m. that night and the register used. I save it to a folder called Case. Phone sits on my kitchen counter at midnight. He texts, "If you take this to HR, you'll ruin my job." He writes, "This will be worse for you." He calls at 2 a.m. and hangs up. I let it ring. The calls show up on my log. Packet sits in my bag that night. I add the clerk's time card, my sister's screenshots, the email receipts, and the call log. I give them to a recommended lawyer. He looks and nods. He says, "You have a documented pattern." He says this can be a civil or workplace case. Envelope sits on my table a week later. Mall security mails a formal export of the footage with timestamps. It includes stills and a retrieval log by Ethan, the guard. It shows who requested the clip and when. I print it. Binder sits on my kitchen table the next morning. I organize everything by date. I add sticky notes. I send copies to HR, the manager, and my lawyer. I mark pages where the loyalty account and clerk notes match timestamps. Book sits open on my lap that night. I read case law on workplace harassment. I underline patterned behavior and coercion through relationship leverage. I make notes. Document threats, save voicemails, keep receipts. Lamp sits low the night of mediation. The clerk arrives with his manager. The HR rep sits stiff. I open the binder and lay printed stills on the table. I leave one photo face up. I say, "This happened in public." The mall confirms it. The clerk goes pale. Form sits in front of the clerk, he says. "I didn't realize how this would look," my boyfriend says. "I made a mistake," he says it flat. The HR rep writes mitigating circumstance. The manager says there will be a written warning. The clerk must apologize in writing. Envelope sits with a small check a week later. Loss prevention credits my account for the returned item's value. The clerk's supervisor writes, "We regret the incident. It is small, but it shows someone noticed." Box sits sealed on the counter. I do not open it. I lock the clip in a secure folder on my phone. I change passwords. I send files to my lawyer. He files the police report number in my folder. I sleep less, but I sleep. Phone sits quiet the night I decide not to reply. He texts, "I'm sorry." I do not answer. I close the binder and slide the stills into a locked drawer. Paper wins small battles. A receipt with his phone number lies on my kitchen table in plain sight, and I freeze. Receipt sits on the table. I pick it up with trembling fingers. Gift box sits on the counter with the bow still tied. Phone sits face down on the coffee table. I flip it and see a missed call. Ring sits in my hand when he calls back 5 minutes later. He sounds flat. Window sits behind him when he stands with his back to me. He keeps the phone in his pocket. Conversation sits between us when he says, "I helped a woman whose car broke down." Ring sits silent in my palm when he mumbles and hangs up. CCTV thumbnail sits in a message from the store assistant. His sister forwards it to me. Card sits in my hand with a tiny heart next to the number. The ink smudges. Call log sits on my desk when I call his sister. She answers quickly. Voice memo sits on her phone when she says, "She texted me 5 minutes after he left." Photo sits in the assistant's thread. It shows the kiosk and his smile. Notebook sits under the shelf where I keep receipts. I toss the new one on top. Screen sits open on his phone when I unlock it. I read messages to the unknown number. Text sits from 2 weeks earlier. "You look great today." Text sits again later. "When are you free?" Then, "I leave town Sunday." Email sits in my inbox with a voice clip from the assistant. She names him and laughs. Bank receipt sits next to the gift. The mall time matches the kiosk photo time. Call log sits under the bank receipt. 2 short calls show at 9:12 p.m. and 11:58 p.m. Calendar sits on his phone with a lunch entry matching the mall time. Wallet sits in his back pocket when my keys jingle. He pulls it out like a reflex. Envelope sits in my hand with a printed screenshot of his outgoing text. I show it to him. Statement sits between us when he says, "I didn't send that." Badge sits on the assistant's next message. She adds her employee ID and says she felt weird. Printer sits on the floor when I print the CCTV still and the voice clip. Pages stack up. Desk sits where I call the mall. Luis, the manager, answers and offers footage. Locker sits in the mall office when Luis plays video on a small monitor. He points to the timestamp. Clipboard sits on Luis's desk. I sign the request form for the official export. Receipt sits center on my kitchen table again. I email the files to a lawyer I find online. Call log sits in the printed packet. The lawyer asks if I want a temporary order. Court form sits in my inbox the next morning. I print and fill it out by hand. Desk sits behind the clerk as she stamps my complaint. I hand over my folder. Hallway sits crowded the morning of the hearing. He arrives and stands at the back. Bench sits before us when the judge reads the complaint aloud. He asks him to confirm events. Glove sits on his hand as he folds his fingers and looks at me. He says, "I didn't mean anything." Microphone sits on the clerk's desk when I hand over the evidence packet. Luis and the assistant speak. Luis says, "We have footage, Your Honor. Timestamps show him at 5:28 p.m. Assistant says, "I wrote the receipt number and saved the texts." My folder sits open on the bench. Paper sits thick in the judge's hands. He notes the call times and outgoing messages. Lamp sits above my head as the judge asks him to explain calls at 9, 12, and 11:58 p.m. Clipboard sits with my lawyer when he asks for a temporary protection order. He speaks plainly. Keyboard sits under my fingers as I upload the timestamped message that reads, "Can't wait to see you." Envelope sits sealed when the clerk hands me the temporary order. The order forbids him from contacting me. Badge sits on Luis's shirt as he offers a trespass note. He asks if I want it added to the file. Packet sits in my bag that evening with the printouts and the CCTV still. I add my sent message screenshot. Letter sits on my kitchen table a week later from HR. They open an internal inquiry and place him on leave. Wallet sits empty of excuses. He calls from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Journal sits on my nightstand. I write one line and close it. Actions define respect, not excuses. Chair sits by the window the next morning with the gift box on it. I wrap the receipt in the card. Envelope sits at the manager's desk with a note asking collection by a representative from his sister's house. I sign it. Bed sits quiet that night. I sleep without interruptions. The phone stays on the nightstand. Window sits open a crack. I think about proof, the assistant, and Luis who pulled the still. Book sits on the shelf labeled closed. It holds the signed order and the company memo. Pillow sits under my head as the city hums. I breathe once and let it go. Keep proof, keep distance. A receipt in the trash has his phone number written in black pen, and he says he never gave it to anyone. Receipt sits folded in my fist. He keeps his phone face down on the table. I tap the screen. He does not look up. I ask, "Whose number is this?" He says, "I don't know." A notification blinks. He silences it with his thumb. Box sits wrapped on the counter from the birthday he promised. He stands at the stove and watches the paper fall. I slam the receipt on the box. He freezes. I say, "This is your handwriting," he says. "That is not mine." The ink matches the pen I found in his jacket. Email sits in my inbox the next day. I forward the receipt to his sister. She answers fast. Her text pops up. She says, "He gave it to the woman at the kiosk." I ask, "When?" She says, "Sunday." I saw the thread on her phone. The store name and timestamp read 7:12 p. Logbook sits on the kiosk counter when I go back. The attendant is small and polite. He hands me a folded CCTV thumbnail on his phone. He says, "We save thumbnails for a week." He taps the screen, and the image flashes. A man in my boyfriend's jacket leans over the counter. He laughs. A hand writes on a receipt. The attendant says, "I texted her a screenshot when it happened." I ask, "Can I see the messages?" He says, "They're still in the thread." Notebook sits open on my kitchen table that night. I write the times down. 7:12 p.m. at the kiosk. 7:14 p.m. A missed call from an unknown number. 7:30 p.m. A short message that says, "Nice meeting you." My hands tremble as I write one name again and again. Camera sits on the security terminal when I call the mall. The security manager sounds tired. He says, "We pull the footage for those times, but we need a formal request." I say, "I will come." He tells me what ID to bring and what the timestamp will look like. He gives a reference number. He says, "We keep logs for 30 days. Cardboard sits under my chair during lunch the next week. He ignores my texts. He answers when I call. He keeps the conversation short. He says, "Work is busy." He says, "I will be late." He says nothing about the woman at the kiosk. His voice is flat. I hear dishes clinking. He tells me to trust him. File folders sit on the passenger seat when I drive to the mall security office. I hand the receipt and my notebook to the manager. He sorts the papers and calls back to the terminal. He slides a single grayscale still across the counter. The image catches 3 people in a blur. One person turns. The jacket stands out. He points to the timestamp. He says, "Look at the jacket number and the time." Receipt paper sits folded in my pocket after the thumbnail. I open the message thread the attendant sent. The text says, "He gave me his number, LOL." The outgoing bubble shows my boyfriend's name. I screenshot it. I call his sister. She answers without hesitation. She says, "I can confirm. He told me about it later." Her silence after that is long. Sheet sits on the HR website when I fill out the complaint form. I type fax-only times messages. The thumbnail reference number. I attach the screenshot. I keep each line short. I hit send. The confirmation email pings back. It has a case number and a reply that says, "We will review this." Folder sits on the conference room table during the HR meeting. The room smells like coffee and old paper. An HR rep sits opposite me. He opens my file and reads the logs. He keeps his voice careful. He says, "We need more proof of intent." I say, "It is proof," he says. "Witness statements, please." The room is quiet except for paper rustling. Notebook pages sit between us when I hand over the printouts. I read the dates out loud. I hold the receipt up. He looks at the CCTV reference. He says, "We will contact security." He calls the mall and waits on hold. He finally says, "We will speak to him and the witness. This is an investigation." Phone battery sits low as I wait for the HR update. He texts in the late afternoon. The message is brief. I talk to HR. They think it is over. I read it 3 times. I call him. He does not pick up. I leave a voicemail. "I want to know what happened at the kiosk." I say nothing else. Envelope sits on my kitchen counter the day the company lawyer calls. The lawyer's voice is cool. He says, "The complaint went to an internal process." I ask, "What does that mean?" He says, "We will need the CCTV stills and the witness statement." I give him the attendant's name and the reference number. He says, "We will proceed." Clock sits above the hallway when HR schedules a meeting that includes my boyfriend. The conference table is the same. He sits with his arms crossed. He looks tired but composed. The HR rep reads the complaint aloud. He says, "We have a complaint alleging misuse of company influence." I push the printouts forward, and the evidence packet slides into his hands. Badge sits on the mall security manager's lanyard when he arrives to verify the footage. He walks in with a thin manila folder and a USB drive. He hands it to HR. He says, "This is the footage. This is the log." He speaks to the HR rep and then to my boyfriend. He says, "This is the time-stamped clip from 7:12 p.m." My boyfriend looks away. Paper sits on the table when HR plays the clip. The room fills with the low hum of the player. The grainy video shows my boyfriend standing at the kiosk. He smiles at the attendant. He writes on the receipt. Then he hands the paper to a woman. She types the number into her phone and laughs softly. The clip ends with both of them walking away. My boyfriend says, "I don't remember doing that." I say, "You wrote the number," he says. "Maybe I scribbled something." It was nothing. Receipt copy sits in front of the HR rep while I watch his face. He reads the attendant's message. He looks at the outgoing bubble that shows my boyfriend's name. He asks the security manager if the thread originated from my boyfriend's phone. The security manager says, "No." The screenshot shows his name in the thread as the sender. The HR rep's pen stops, he says. "This suggests direct contact." Document sits on the table when the HR rep calls him into the hall. They close the door. I hear muffled voices. When he returns, his shoulders slump, he says. "They think I gave it," he says. "It was a stupid joke," I say. "You said nothing when she texted you," he says. "I didn't know she had it." His hands twist. Wallet sits in his back pocket when HR asks him to hand over his phone. He hesitates. He says, "That is invasive." Farr says, "We need voluntary cooperation to confirm log details." He unlocks the phone with his thumb. The screen shows call logs and a recent outgoing message. The outgoing message matches the kiosk timestamp. He says, "I didn't send that." He avoids my eyes. Envelope seal sits broken when the HR rep slides the outcome across the table 2 days later. The letter says he will be suspended for 3 weeks pending further action. It lists misuse of position and failure to be forthcoming. The letter notes the security footage and the attendant's message. He folds the letter slowly. He says, "This is ridiculous." I say, "You gave your number away to someone at a kiosk," he says. It was a dumb moment. Packet sits on my lawyer's desk when we compile everything into one package. The packet has the receipt, the CCTV stills, the attendant's screenshot, the HR outcome letter, and my typed timeline. The lawyer tapes the final page and slides the packet toward me. He says, "We can escalate this to a formal complaint to corporate." I say, "I want him held to the same rules I follow." He nods. He says, "This packet proves pattern and intent." Laptop sits open in the security office when I finally see the full resolution clips. The manager pulls frames and points to the angles. He says, "This shows he took the initiative to write and present the receipt." He exports time-coded frames and stamps them with the mall's watermark. He hands me a printed copy. The frames show a clear profile and the exact pen stroke. The manager signs the log. Screen capture sits among the printed frames and becomes my key object. It is a time-stamped screenshot of the outgoing text, with the sender's name matching his profile. I email it to HR, my lawyer, and his sister. I write one sentence in the body. "This proves the contact originated from his phone." I hit send, and the files go into 3 inboxes. Envelope returns to my mailbox the week after the packet is filed. The notice inside says he resigned. It is dated the day after HR presented the findings to corporate. The envelope is thin, no call, no protest. His desk gets cleared by a courier. I watch boxes move and his nameplate taken down. Ring sits on my finger that night out of habit when he calls me one last time. "He sounds small," he says. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I say, "You were careless," he says. "I will explain." I say, "There is nothing left to explain." His voice cracks. He says, "I'm sorry." I hang up. Lamp sits on my bedside table the next night. I fold the receipt and slide it into the packet. I seal it with tape and put it in a drawer. The sealed packet feels lighter than the loose paper did. I lock the drawer. I sit on the bed and listen to the city quiet outside. Box remains unopened on the counter. I do not take the bow off. I leave the gift where it is. I do not want the paper thing the receipt was attached to. I want the truth that came out of a small, sloppy moment. The packet and the screenshot do not fix everything. They make a boundary clear. Lamp clicks off. I close my eyes. Boundaries matter more than excuses.